We come now to session 3, and we at Jesuit Social Services have a confession to make to you. On this panel we fail on the test of gender representation, but we think it's probably appropriate that on the topic of prisons, if we were going to fail on one topic, then this was probably the one where the males should have the say. Our presenter is Rod Wise. Julie Edwards said to me, well, you know, we weren't going to have many department people involved, but Rod Wise is a person of such extraordinary ethical propriety, with such international experience, and also a sense of humour and sense of connectedness with us, that we are absolutely delighted to have him with us today. I gather he also produces a very good website about prison films, so maybe he'll give us the link to that during the course of his observations. Rod is the Deputy Commissioner for Operations in Corrections Victoria, and he's worked in the corrections field for more than 30 years. Starting as a prison officer at Pentridge, he has, amongst other things, run a community corrections program, worked extensively in sentence management, and been the governor of no less than 3 maximum security prisons. He's been Deputy Commissioner since 2007, and his role presently covers the oversight of both prisons and community corrections. So Rod, thank you very much for giving him your time today, and we look forward to your observations on prisons.
Thanks, Frank, and it's a delight to be here. Can I start, please, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and other elders here today. It's lovely to get an invitation where you're identified as an expert on anything. It's very polite of people to address me so. I must say, in my own organisation, people are a lot less generous, probably with very good reason. The prison movie stuff I probably need to talk about, and prisonmovies.net, if anyone is remotely interested and you've got no reason to be at all. But I started writing a screenplay some years ago after being a technical expert on a number of prison films that were being done and TV series, and I thought, oh, this should be easy, I could do one of these myself. And then I got halfway through the screenplay and I thought, oh, what if this has been done before? And I went back and started to do some research, just in case the plot that I was writing had been done several times before. And prison movie plots are done several times before. I'm probably up to 300 or so prison movies, and it's only now, when I'm standing here, that I reflect upon the fact that there's probably only 1 or 2 of them that touch upon humane and efficient criminal justice systems. Most of them deal with brutality and unpleasantness, and so all that time I've spent watching films has been a complete and utter waste of time. I did wrestle a little bit with how I'd start this, and I don't want to trivialise things, but I was at a meeting a week or so ago with a group of very experienced and very involved prison workers. They weren't corrections people, they were external to corrections, and we were talking about the changes in the female population over the years. And one of these people who has been in the job for 20 odd years said, we're doing it all wrong. The first priority for any prison system these days, in working with the female population anyway, should be teaching things like deportment, manners, etiquette, and elocution. And that sounds awfully trite and silly, but some of the themes of that, I think, are quite right. She said it, I must say, with her tongue a little bit in cheek, but so many of our prisoners are so damaged and so ill-prepared for the community in which we want to put them, and lack so many of the basic skills, that they are going to struggle in a whole heap of different areas once we do release them back into the community, in terms of getting a job, being able to make pro-social friends, all those sorts of things, without a lot of assistance on our part. And we do have, in Victoria, what I would regard as the harder end of the market. I'm very grateful to Steve Mile before to talk about prison in Victoria being a sentencing option of last resort, and that's how we see it from the corrections side of things. In Victoria, our rate of imprisonment is around about 106 per 100,000, and that's a significant number. And it's grown substantially since I joined the job 30 years ago. I think it was only about 65 per 100,000, so there has been this substantial growth over time. And before Wayne picks me up on it, I also need to acknowledge with some shame that the equivalent imprisonment rate for Aboriginal people in custody is somewhere between 1,100 and 1,300 per 100,000 Aboriginal people. But what that means is that in Victoria, compared to some other states and some other territories, our prisons are full of people who we believe are at the tougher end of the market. The people in other jurisdictions, like New South Wales has got its prison numbers coming down. Victoria's got about 4,800 prisoners. New South Wales has just dropped below 10,000. And so their imprisonment rate has been up around the 180 per 100,000, and so they imprison substantially more people, and those additional people just wouldn't be in jail in Victoria in the first place. America, of course, has got something like 760 per 100,000, and it's always useful when I'm speaking to groups of sceptics about the way that criminal justice is done in Victoria, to ask them if they've been to America and felt 7 times as safe in an American city by virtue of the fact that there are 7 times as many people per 100,000 in jail. But to pick up on the deportment stuff, I was in Silverwater Women's Prison in New South Wales only last week, and they were taking me around, and as we all do when interstate visitors come, to try and show off our institutions in the best possible light. And the thing that they got most excited about was this charitable organisation who comes into the prison on a regular basis and, as a departing gift to the prisoners, gives them a suit and new shoes. And so their deportment program was all compressed into this single outfitting, and I'm not sure that it has any long-term benefits. The point of that is not to trivialise stuff, but to just reinforce the point, I think, that prisons are often expected to rehabilitate and to restore stuff to the people in our charge, and it's so often very far from the mark. There is nothing to rehabilitate to. Our job is about habilitation, and in so many cases. So the question I guess I need to address is, how do we give prisoners the best chance at living law-abiding lives in a humane and efficient manner? To start with, I think probably need to concede that there are a whole heap of people for whom any intervention that we do, other than working with them decently and encouraging and those sorts of things, is probably not going to be effective, at least this time around. For a variety of reasons, the lure of drugs is too strong. They see no reason to change. We're simply not ever going to be able to paint a picture for them of a rosy, law-abiding lifestyle that they can either aspire towards or see themselves in. Their loyalty to the general community is very often compromised, as I think Frank Vincent might have said yesterday. And their loyalty, as someone said today, to those non-conforming communities, whether it's a drug-using community or some other anti-social community on the outside, is very, very strong. And we just don't have the capacity to break away and break up those support networks that they've relied upon for so long. Others, of course, just lack the cognitive capacity to deal with the sorts of things that we would like them to do while they're with us in jail. And of that group of people, some very sadly will fall by the wayside, and others, rather inevitably, will keep coming back to us and keep coming back to us very often till they're 40, and then something magical seems to happen, and they suddenly start to take stock of their lives, and it's much easier to work with them once they get to that point. I've often said that the best rehabilitative program that I can devise is getting a pill that turns young men into 40-year-olds very, very quickly. But even for those others that we reckon we can work with, and that there's a little gleam of opportunity for, they still, as we've heard already today on a number of occasions, they often lack the basic skills to deal effectively with the community in which we want to release them. Some of those basic things that all of us take for granted, they haven't had passed on to them by their parents or by their teachers or by their coaches and those sorts of things. They come from very chaotic family circumstances and places where becoming good citizens is certainly not a priority in their upbringing. But there's still plenty that we can do in that space, and that's where I guess I want to spend a little bit of time. And Trish Faulkner said earlier today that, can you really find dignity in prison? Is there an opportunity to find any treatment that upholds dignity? And I guess I understand that point of view. Prisons inherently are an affront to dignity, and I don't want to suggest otherwise. But I do think that we've done an awful lot in that area over certainly my career. And if I go back to when I started in the job, Pentridge was the flagship prison, and the remand yards, which a number of people would have had the delight of going in and out of here, seeing clients and so on, were just appalling. They were open yards with open showers and toilets at one end. And what we did with prisoners is trot them out of their cells first thing in the morning and shunt them into these yards, and then they would carry all their belongings with them, and then at the end of the day we'd put them back inside again. In my day, when we started, there was still F Division in Pentridge, which had dormitories of 40 and 60 men, and there was a rape there virtually every night, and you only had a small number of staff on duty, and they weren't going to go in there at night because it was too dangerous to open the doors and go in there and intervene. They were very, very unpleasant places. And quite aside from all the things that we now expect in every cell or every prison, things like televisions in cells and sewered cells and those sorts of things. Now that's a relatively short period, 30 years, and I guess that is progress, and it is seen by a lot of people as good sport to knock how the prison system operates. But if we can improve the prison system by the same magnitude over the next 30 years, the prison system in the 2040s will be very, very effective, one would hope. It's an issue, again, that I stress to new prison officers. Prison officers join for a whole heap of reasons. They're a diverse group, and much more diverse than I think people expect them to be. But most of them join up thinking that one of their major tasks will be stopping people escape. And so their focus is on what happens in the jail. And one of the things that I try to do with them is to say that that's not their main task. Their main task is to be concerned about what happens when they get out and rejoin the community, and to get them to think about what happens on the other side of the wall. And because there are so many areas of deprivation in prisoners' early upbringing, many prisoners' upbringings, I reinforce that just by being good role models to prisoners, they can do an awful lot, and they don't have to go out and seek to be good role models. They can just be good people, and they might be the first people that prisoners have experienced in a long time who exhibit the sorts of behaviours that we would want those prisoners to be once they get back into the community. So we say to the prison officers, you need to be fair and consistent, that you need to be able to resolve conflict in a calm and reasoned manner, that you have to set boundaries and stick by them. There's no good, clearly, in telling prisoners to do one thing and then reinforcing some other behaviour. By encouraging positive behaviour in the prisoners, by challenging inappropriate behaviour and attitudes, and there's usually plenty of those, by fostering in prisoners the things that we know that if they spend more time on when they're back out in the community, they will assist them to live more law-abiding lives and may keep them out of jail. To explain why rules are in place and to encourage them to address their offending behaviour, if not for their own sake, but for the sake of those people who care about them and are left on the other side of the wall, and so on. So the point, I guess, is that a humane system, from our perspective, values the contribution, it more relies upon the contribution of our prison staff and the behaviours that they exhibit, just as it does the systems and the buildings and the programs and the services that attract all the government funding and those sorts of things. It is the core of our approach that our good people need to demonstrate good attitudes and good behaviours. I also want to touch briefly on Tony Vincent's work, and I was years ago I was on a job for the Attorney General in which I was having a look at the issues of poverty in Victoria, and it was the first time I became acquainted with Tony's work and spent a lot of time looking at it, and it's become very much embedded in the way that Corrections Victoria now does business. And I hate to admit, but I couldn't remember exactly what our mission statement said until I checked with one of my colleagues, but she reassured me that a couple of years ago we included into our mission statement stuff. Well, it's got all the stuff around humane, secure, safety of the community and those sorts of things. But we've also included in it that part of our responsibility is to address social disadvantage, and it has been reflected in a lot of the new programs and new thinking that we've tried to instil into the correction system. A lot of that is around breaking the cycle of intergenerational disadvantage, and our most recent new programs in the system are two programs that we've put in place at Manganese Correctional Centre. One of them is around literacy and one of them is around parenting, and the parenting has got a number of functions clearly, and part of it is to teach prisoners how to better be able to parent their kids from a distance, which is not an easy task. But it's also to try and ensure that the prisoners don't make the same mistakes in the way that they parent their kids as their parents may have done. In terms of the literacy stuff, again, the most obvious approach is to try and get people who've got significant literacy deficiencies to a point where they can become more active in the employment marketplace. But it also has the additional intent of igniting in them a desire to see their kids get an education, to learn to read, to stay at school, all of those sorts of things that are so critical to better outcomes and that are so pointedly identified in Tony's research. It's also terrific wandering around a unit that deals with literacy and seeing the joy that's in prisoners when they get a card from their kids and they can read it for the first time. It's just magic. So we do all this education stuff, the training, vocational training, all our treatment programs, they all have that side effect, I think, of being able to impact upon the families and hopefully deter some of the families from following in their mothers' and fathers' footsteps. It doesn't always work, of course, and I spoke recently, and Julie's asked that I retell the story of an encounter I had at a conference only a couple of weeks ago, and I was approached by this bloke whom I've known, sadly, for probably 25 of my 30 years in the jail system. And he has got out of jail after serving a significant murder blue. And he's been out of jail for 4 months. And it's the longest he's ever spent out of jail since he was a teen. And the stuff that I guess was really difficult for me is that this is a bloke who did most things right in jail. He accessed all the treatment programs, the education programs. I think he got a degree, and he's not a stupid man by any stretch of the imagination. And he was telling me just the difficulty that he faces absolutely every day not to do something just to get himself back in jail. And that he told me of leaning on a police car in Flinders Street for 15 minutes, hoping that they would overreact and lock him up. And at one stage, he got locked up for 4 hours, I think, and he found that the most comforting 4 hours, it's the only time he slept well, he said, since he was released. And this is a bloke who is smart, has got real capabilities, he's got a good work ethic, he's got all of those sorts of things, but he just is struggling on a day-to-day basis. Our job is tough, and some of our people, of course, that we deal with are not the most pleasant either. But it's one of the ways that we've found in recent times that we can get through to our staff who are inclined to give up on prisoners because of the continued bad behaviour, to reframe that in a way that they think that what they're doing is not just working with the prisoner, him or herself, but also impacting on their kids. It's a much more honourable motivation to do that work, it seems. Part of our challenge, I think, is to educate the community into looking at some of these issues in different ways, and I know that Frank and others have spoken about that already. My mind always goes back when I'm talking about educating the community, because most of my staff get very, very disappointed in what they see as a lack of response on our part to the Neil Mitchells and the Herald Sun headlines and those sorts of things. And I'm always reminded of some years ago when we were very proud of some work that we'd done in the vocational sphere, and we went out to the community, and the talkback radio was full for the next day with mothers ringing up and saying, what is it, why does my son have to commit an offence in order to get into a TAFE course? I can't get him into a TAFE course on my own. And it's acted as a significant disincentive for us to try that path again. The answer, of course, is to reframe our whole approach away from prisoners getting an unfair advantage, which is what unfortunately a large proportion of the community sees, I think, to making it clear that the community sees that the prisoners are getting only what is due to them and those opportunities that every Australian citizen ought to be entitled to. We need to be saying that all that we're doing with the prisoners is trying to give them a fair go. And that, I guess, is my position. Our job in trying to turn people around is to make sure that we give them a fair go. Thank you.
Thank you, Rod. Now, on our panel, we have a couple of recidivists, Tony Vinson and Frank Vinson. But joining them, fresh faces, are Joe Caddy, and also we're privileged to have with us Leonard Atone, and I think we might hear from Leonard at the next session as well. So, some brief comments from our panel, who'll introduce themselves insofar as they need introduction, and comment on Rod's remarks. Tony.
Look, I think a book could be written on almost every aspect that we go over so quickly today, and that's fine. The books will be written. I want to say that what Rob just described sounded pretty similar to my own observations of prisons in the British tradition, but not necessarily in other cultures. And I'm going to throw out a bit of a challenge by referring to that. But even the decencies and consideration that were mentioned, small gestures by people going out of their way to be of assistance, do of course draw appreciation from those in prison. Just recently I was in the X-ray department of one of the large hospitals in Sydney with a relative, and I was most embarrassed when a former prisoner came up with tears in his eyes and embraced me and wouldn't let go of me for about 20 minutes, and I asked him what the hell I'd done that warranted all this. But equally surprised but a bit concerned, and our colleague will know who I'm referring to but no one else. A couple of prisoners, former prisoners, came up to me at a beachside suburb and said, "We see you're having a bit of a tussle with that minister. Would you like us to fix him?" Well, to paraphrase, I could try to remember the things that were very positive in systems that I've seen. They're probably on a scale similar to what Rob has described. But I want to just briefly, in a couple of minutes, make my contribution to this by saying that you can be shocked when you step out of your own culture and go somewhere where the British pattern hasn't existed within the prison system. So to paraphrase Bergman's, one of his titles, scenes, this is scenes from two very positive prison systems in Sweden and Holland, where I've spent a very considerable amount of time. Indeed, I was told that I'd be entered in something like the Guinness Book of Records in Northern Europe for having seen more prisons in Sweden than any other living person. So the first thing I want to say is that we tend to equate rehabilitation services of a reformative kind with decency and humanness in the prisons. Both of the systems that have stood out in my international experience disclaim any pretense to rehabilitating people. They have the view that it will be a terrific major achievement if people go out the back door no worse than they came in the front. And simply flowing from that, in Holland, the philosophy called the agony, the human way, people are obliged, and I'm now going to the first of the, the first of what will appear on the screen. Staff-prisoner relationships have a high degree of normalcy about them. It's not that in both those systems people are excessively friendly. There's an ebb and flow of emotions rather than a constant state of dislike for those in uniform and dislike for those in the prison guard. And it's been engineered. One of the devices used is to simply make sure that people are in each other's company day in and day out, not moved around, no shift alterations and so on. It becomes more and more difficult to stereotype the person who is your guard or the person who is in your care when you have to operate on that basis, and when officialdom says, get to know this person as a person, meet the family when they visit. You are entitled to ask the staff member about his family situation. To sit in a cell, in Holland it was, Sweden, I'm sorry, with a couple of prisoners and an attendant, a vorderer, meaning carer, an interesting difference in title. And I thought the gentleman who was the vorderer was actually an inmate. And a chap was telling us about how persistently he felt aggressive and needed to punch somebody. And this little person, he was diminutive, piped up and said, "But we're helping you to recognise when it's coming on, aren't we?" And I asked the people, "Does this do you any good, having this person in your midst commenting on your behaviour?" "Yes," they said, "he's so bloody ordinary that if he can manage outside, we ought to be able to." And so it goes. Security, the people operating on that basis are not looking over their shoulder. They believe that they could not operate in a British-type, inherited British tradition prison. because they know what's going on. They take the pulse daily. They follow an as-if principle. If I behave decently towards you, that puts you under an obligation to behave decently towards me. But rely excessively on that, and like the Dutch guard, I will say, I gave you my finger and you took the whole hand. They challenge people to give an account of themselves. A high degree of officer involvement. Well, not only is the officer, the prison officer, involved in talking with the prisoners, working alongside the prisoners, but also the families. It's not that uncommon for an officer to go on a home visit and come back and report, first of all, to the manager or superintendent, as we would say, to keep feet on the ground, but to act as the intermediary between the person in custody and the family. Each prisoner has to have a personal plan, and it's the prison officer, the warder in Sweden, the guard in Holland, who is absolutely delegated with responsibility for implementing the plan for that person. The prison officer role is pivotal. Well, that's quickly a reference to the fact that, of course, there are psychologists and social workers aplenty in the institution. There are teachers there, but it's done through the officer. The guidance is extended, so that the notion of a progressive prison system being one where there would be a declining emphasis on the role of the day-to-day warderer is quite incorrect in the light of this experience. It comes infinitely more into prominence. Contracts are explicit and written. I've mentioned the personal plan. I think I've said enough about that. The prison, a measure of last resort. So in both countries, there is a reluctance to use the institution except as a way of marking out the boundaries of acceptable social behaviour. If you are so disregarding of the well-being of fellow citizens as to drive a car when you're under the influence, well, you'll be one of the 30% of inmates who are in there for that. And accompanying that, an institution called BRAW, which has the challenge of constantly reviewing the things that lead us to put people away and asking, in relation to various types of behaviour, what does the greatest social damage? And so fraud is coming up as a more prominent thing to warrant serious attention. Now, there's a lot of dialoguing between the researchers, the officialdom, and of course the judicial officers. The staff's good intentions are girded by prisoner rights. Quite explicit. To give an example, if you believe you've been dealt with extremely badly by the authorities, you have a right to an interview with a journalist. The guards say that's fine. We don't want any mucking around in here, but we require equal time because of the reality that sometimes people are complaining in circumstances where really it's the staff who are copying it. When the Karolinska Institute has conducted surveys of the well-being of staff, they find that the greater work satisfaction ratings go to those who feel I'm working in a fair place and we're doing our best to prepare people for re-entry to society. Finally, productive work is required. This is a most important link with the outside world. The one way you can get up the nose of the authorities is to be slack at work. This is the most practical thing we can do, and we'll bring in local industries. You'll learn how to operate their lathes and their equipment, and it'll be a seamless transition the day that you go to work in their factory or whatever it's going to be. And finally, what about those people who, inconsiderate as they are, scorn our interest and don't respond well to our positive actions towards them? Well, all they do is up the dosage. Everything I've described is more intensified, so that you go to a particular prison, which everyone talks about as being terrible, Kumla, and you find that there's no difference. It's just that there's one official for each person, and they do more of what I've just described. So I hope that indicates one thing. It can be done. It's the recent past. No doubt there are white ants in there right now, making sure that it's pulled down. I gave a talk at the Ministry of Justice, and I practiced for a week saying, both. There's a Dutch speaker here, you can correct me, but alle verandering is geen verbetering, meaning not all change is necessarily for the better.
Thank you, Tony. Now, Joe Caddy.
Thank you. Look, it's great to be able to have all these sessions on this topic, because I think it's really important about knowing what to do with those who don't fit in, and how do we actually manage that as a society. It is a really big question, and it has to be dealt with seriously. I'm Joe Caddy. I'm Chief Executive Officer of Catholic Care, which is a general social welfare community agency working with families, working with communities. As Chief Executive Officer, there's a lot of signing of papers and approving of policies and lots of work like that to do. A very happy release for me is to go to prison. It's a very interesting thing also as a Catholic priest to go to my parish, which is the Metropolitan Remand Centre, each Sunday and say a couple of masses and be there generally for people if they want to catch up and have a talk about that, and sometimes some extracurricular to sort of work with those families outside of the prison as well. But it is very good because it actually focuses me on the importance of a lot of the work that happens in the community sector, that a lot of our work, in fact, is keeping people out of those sort of places, prisons, which we hope are the last resort. And resort is taken up in all sorts of ways, isn't it, Rod? It's not a holiday resort, believe me. But the media often wants to portray it for that, for some sort of... I don't know what the interest is. It's quite a madness, because one of the things that I also observe, and being in that pivotal role also of going into prison and then back to a welfare organisation, is that I know just how highly accountable we are for funding to funders, to the community generally for the use of money and resources, and I know certainly to my own board for the programs that we're running. And I think if we were coming back with the sort of stated aims of the prison system and the successes that we'd be able to demonstrate, we'd be told to close the program down, because too many people find their way back into prison. And it's not a criticism of the terrific people who are working in there and trying to do the right thing, but a whole political agenda that says, let's do more of this in the face of evidence that says it's not effective. A damning bit of research recently, and I can't quite remember the date of it, but it was undertaken. It indicated that the more a person has been to prison, the more likely they are to go back to prison. I mean, that's just crazy, and it doesn't seem to be achieving the aims it wants. It needs to. I mean, maybe that 40-year age pill would be the better option. But why do we keep sort of frightening old ladies and men in Mentone about an increase in crime rate when it's really only 25-year-olds in King Street who are the who are the victims of so much of this? You know, we frighten these people. We get a whole political agenda running about let's do more of what's not working, and that just seems to be a madness. I think it's also, and we should also say that the ones who end up in those prisons, as Rod said, I think they come from very often very chaotic backgrounds, very deprived backgrounds. They won't be the sort of lovely young people that we'll see at Derby Day next week, they're just not there. They haven't read life's menu. They don't get to do the sorts of things that we think good, healthy young people should be doing, like going to Derby Day or even Cox Plate. They won't. That was a bit pointed. So there is so much in those backgrounds of those people, and we put young people into prison. I'll just very briefly, just one little story of saying mass there one morning and having a very senior prisoner who'd been around for a long time, Lebanese man, came up to me and introduced me to these two young fellows, young boys, 18, and really you look at some of them and you just think, you're a baby, what are you doing? You couldn't be 18. So anyway, there were these twins, and the older prisoner had taken them under his wing and he was going to protect them a little bit. and said, "Father, I brought him along." He introduced me. He said, "I thought a bit of religion would do them good." And the poor little rabbits looked like they were in a spotlight, you know. So we're going through Mass, and it was they were really trying to join in as earnestly as they could, but it was very foreign territory. Anyway, they came up together towards down the aisle for communion, and they were one behind the other, and the big arm came across the top of them and said, "No communion for them, Father, it's Ramadan." But, I mean, the point of it is there's these innocent babes abroad, and the contamination that they're facing in that system, you know, that's not good. So I know politically we now have a commitment to 500 new beds in this state. Let's hope that it can be in the areas of reform that Rod was talking about. If we're going to put new beds in, let's put them into places where we're trying really intentionally to work with people to make the most effective results. And I think some of the great work that's being done at the Judy Lazarus Centre is fantastic. It's much too small, not enough prisoners get there, but it's a reintegration prison. Rod would tell you more about it, but it's a prison that reintegrates people into society. And when you see people that we heard about who leave prison, sometimes maximum security prison, and go back to a family after being locked up for years, how difficult is that? Not only for them, but for their family. And I visit families in precisely that situation. Judy Lazarus Centre is integration. It allows people to go home during the day, go to work, undertake courses and that sort of stuff. And some very serious offenders at the end of long sentences are going through that program. I think that's very helpful. I think if we could get some sort of minimum security type of remand setting, it would be very helpful as well, because at the moment everyone's in together, the worst with the best. So some young guy who's never been in trouble before was extradited recently from Western Australia. Well, you can't give him bail because he's got nowhere to go, high flight risk, so he's in remand. His co-accused has already been sentenced and was given a suspended sentence, so probably won't do any time. And this guy's in a maximum security with some pretty bad people. So lots of reforms that can happen, and I think on the media side of things, when the prison system gets under the hammer for positive reforms, then it shouldn't only be the prison system that has to defend that. Good activists across the whole sector should be coming out in support of that and backing them up. Thanks.
That's great. Your story there, Joe, I was in a remote immigration detention centre one day and the local bishop came to say Mass. At the end of it he said to me, "I think a lot of Muslims made their first communion today." Frank Vincent.
I suppose one of the most disturbing features about the way in which our prison system is operating is that in spite of the best endeavours of people like Rod Wise, who is concerned that the conditions should be as good as they humanly can be, that for some reason or other we are concerned to increase the number of people that we're sending to jail and to keep them there longer. There is ample material, statistics from all over the world to demonstrate that there is no relationship of the kind that's being asserted between incarceration and the incidence of crime or the length of imprisonment, the incidence of crime. It's not as if this is unknown or even novel, but for some reason or other, it just isn't communicated to the public and it certainly doesn't sell. Perhaps the most interesting example of the way in which all of this has developed is to compare our situation with that in the United States. Over the period from 1985 onward, the prison population in the US has been steadily increasing. And it's been increasing to the point that we now have something in the region of 2.2 million people either in prisons or in jails. Jails over there accommodating sentences up to a year. They have, in addition, if an extraordinary number of people on current corrections orders. The last number that I saw in relation to that indicated that 1 in every 32 adult Americans was currently subject to a corrections order of some kind. It could be probation, it could be any kind, but an extraordinary percentage of the population. And if you look at the way in which that operates with respect to specific groups of people in the society, then of course you find the most extraordinary imbalances between the black population and and of course the Spanish American people and so forth. But yet there is absolutely nothing in the statistics that would justify that kind of development. We seem to have found it necessary to pursue exactly the same process in Australia in our various jurisdictions. Whilst Victoria has traditionally been a low imprisonment state in terms of sentencing, and our judges and magistrates have been concerned to try and ensure that prison is a last resort, there is still a steady increase, and yet it never seems to be enough. It never seems to be the case that the community has been told that the world is a relatively safe place, that we don't need to incarcerate these people as much as we do, or for as long as we do. One interesting statistic of my own was that shortly after I became the chair of the Adult Parole Board many years ago, it was in 1987, we adopted a policy of trying to release as many people as we sensibly could on parole. And in a period of 3 years, we actually doubled the number of people we had out in the community. And we paid a 2% increase in the breach rate for that. There had simply been no necessity to keep these people in custody. The community wasn't any less safe. And the breach rate, as I said, didn't change terribly much at all, just a very small percentage. I find it very difficult to understand why, as a community, we are prepared to undertake the expense that's involved in this, to see such little value out of a policy of that kind, and yet somehow seem to want to pursue it to the nth degree. I was reminded when reference was made to the damaging impact of sentencing and long sentencing on offenders, of my own experiences with respect to institutionalisation. And it's surprising how quickly it can occur for so many people. I don't care how humane prisons are. They are inherently damaging institutions. The chances that you will actually improve an individual by incarcerating them in an abnormal environment, and as a consequence of living in a totally abnormal environment for a lengthy period of time, they will then be equipped to operate in a normal environment, really escapes me. I just do not know how that reasoning could ever be sensibly adopted. But yet it is the approach that we seem to regard as appropriate. One of the issues that we would encounter quite regularly in the parole board setting was that prisoners who had spent periods of time in custody in this way not only became institutionalised, but found themselves totally lost when they were released into a community with which they were not familiar and which they did not expect to accept them in any reasonable fashion. Depression was a very serious consequence and a very common experience for prisoners, to such an extent that on every occasion when you would be engaged in an interview with a person who had been in custody for any length of time, you had to discuss it with them, to caution them about it, to get them to identify the kinds of difficulties they would be likely to encounter in this regard, and see if you could encourage them to seek assistance. I did have an occasion on which one man who had been in jail for quite a long time was eventually off to see his daughter. And he was embarrassed, he was ashamed of his life, the whole variety of features of the way in which he'd let her down, and all of those kinds of reactions that you might expect. He was to get on a bus and go to see her. Thinking about all of this, he decided he couldn't do it at all. So he walked across the road to a hardware store, bought a knife, took the knife down to the local chemist shop, which was only 2 doors away, held up the chemist shop with the knife, then went back and sat in the bus until he was arrested. It was just safer. This was an environment he understood. This was what life had become. I don't care how long a sentence of imprisonment is. It in the sense that it has a damaging impact. Once any person walks through the doors of a jail, there is a psychological step being made and a psychological barrier being created that is extraordinarily difficult ever to knock down. We talk about using prison as a last resort, but really the extent to which we as a community adopt that is very dubious indeed. From my point of view, I became very concerned, as I said, watching this within the parole system. I've been concerned to watch the penalty rates increasing for a whole variety of offences right across the board with no justification for that at all. And this process, unfortunately, seems to be continuing. The fixing of what are effectively mandatory minimum terms is another step along that path. And insofar as we are collectively able to resist it, then in my view we have an obligation to do so.
Thanks, Frank. And finally, Leonard Otto.
Thanks, everyone. I feel really honoured to be sitting here today. I think that building bridges and not walls is already happening for me, because to be sitting here is something that I thought I'd never do. I'm one of those people that you've been talking about for the last day and a half. And I think it's very important that they be asked what it is that we need to do to improve the system. Because it's all right to talk about what we think and what our experience is and statistics and I mean the amount of people in this room, you know, from Supreme Court judges to CEO of organisations, universities, prison system, and we're asking each other why the system's the way it is. That's mind-boggling. And you know, I was made a state ward at the age of 13 to 17, and I was in and out of Tirana. And I come from a very large family, 10 brothers and sisters, so it was a bit of a relief in one way, but it was horrific in another. And when I hit 18, I was already addicted to drugs, drinking alcohol, in the mental health system, and I was 18 and I was sitting in front of a county court judge being sentenced to 4 years prison for an armed robbery. And that was already too late for me. You know, I mean, once I entered the system, it was just ingrained in me. I'd never been to school. I find it really hard. I hope I don't swear, but I won't be apologising for swearing, because one of the reasons I swore, I remember being in front of a county court judge one day, and he did ask me if I had anything to say for myself, and I said to my barrister, could I swear, and he said, why would you want to swear? And I said, because I need to join the other words together to make a sentence. And it might be a laughing matter, but it's very serious. I mean, a lot of the kids out there today that are on the streets and that we're talking about don't know how to speak. And if they were in this room, I don't know how much they would have understood, to tell you the truth. I mean, it's been really nice listening to people talk about what we could do, what we should do, how we should do it, but it's not what we're doing, and we're the ones doing it. The community is us. We're part of the community. We're talking about the community as it's something somewhere else doing something else. And I've like I said, I came up with ideas, and I had an honest desire not to live the way I was living, but I couldn't do anything about it, And I didn't know what it was I had to do. I knew I had to do something, but I just didn't know what it was I had to do. And I just kept getting further and further into addiction, into crime, into my sentences kept getting bigger. And every time I got released, my family would be writing me letters saying, we're praying for you, we're praying for you, we're praying for you. And every time I got released from prison, sure enough, I'd get ready to go back. And it's been really good listening to people talk about prisons, that they should be used as a last resort. Yet, sometimes for me personally, every time I was locked up, they pretty much saved my life, because my life was out of control out there in the bigger world. I couldn't stop using. I was hurting the people that meant most to me. I was stealing, thieving, manipulating. I was doing just out of control. And every time I got, pulled over by the police or charged with an offence, they pretty much saved my life. And then when I woke up in the cells, of course, sometimes even the cells, try and get into a detox. It takes about 6 weeks when you can do it in a cell. My last detox was I was thrown in a cell. They locked the door. I couldn't scam anyone, manipulate any doctors for any medication. And within a few days, not a few, 5, 6, I started to come good. I started to eat, and physically I started to feel better. And you know what my first thought was, as soon as I started to feel better, they were going to release me back into the mainstream. Who had the drugs? Now, I can't explain that, I think drug and alcohol people should be put under the same category as mental health, because it is a mental health problem. It's not a punitive one where you lock these people up and they don't get treated and then they get released and become maybe your neighbour, I hope, And that's I could go on for hours and hours on this topic, but I'm a direct result of having been through the system. I'm now at school, I'm attempting to do a diploma in community services, and it's just horrific. Horrific. I'm amazed at some of the stuff that some of the teachers are teaching youth workers. Someone's committed... I heard a teacher the other day say, someone wanted to commit suicide and he offered him a rope. I know he was joking, but, people that don't know that's a joke, that are in the system, that are wanting to learn, think that's a good way to treat someone who's continually threatening to kill themselves. And but anyway, I've got to remember that I'm a student. I know what I know, and it's very important that I know what I don't know. And I think admitting that is a really good start for me to get to be part of the solution and not the problem. So thanks for listening.
Over to you.
Gary McFarlane. I currently work for a company that actually runs some prisons and the Australian detention centres. So I'm really interested in how people may view operating a prison. And I'd like to sort of draw the two sessions that we've had together. And I'm interested in the panel's view, this panel and the previous panel's view, on the relevance of a restorative justice approach within a prison environment. We heard about it before, about in terms of the court system, that can it operate within a prison environment, and would it be useful? And I'd also like two questions, possibly, if I can indulge. I'd like Rod's view on the successful operation of a therapeutic approach within a prison. The Marganite approach, I gather, is a therapeutic type approach to managing a prison, and I'd like to know if that's been successful.
Rod, would you like to?
Thanks, Gary. Manganese has yet to be formally evaluated, and we've just engaged a group of people to do that, and so we will be able, at some future time, to be able to talk about just how much of an impact it has. But it certainly has ramifications beyond just manganese, I think, because we've used manganese as a bit of a testing stage for a whole heap of approaches that are new and innovative in our system. And the sorts of things that I guess Tony was talking about, very little things, but at manganese all the staff are referred to by their given name and those sorts of things. Now, they're minor things, but in terms of normalising the interaction between staff and prisoners and those sorts of things, manganese has already proved very successful, and gradually some of those approaches are seeping into the rest of the system and making it easier to introduce some of the changes into prisons, which are traditionally not the easiest places to introduce change into. So hopefully within 12 months I'll be able to give you a more definitive answer on that.
Look, I've been in and out of the prison system for quite a while, like going in to talk to the guys, and I had so much trouble, firstly, getting in to talk to them. Yet when I was in there, you know, like I used to get comments from some of the prisoners' officers like, I don't know what you're doing there, but that is the quietest the prison has been. Yet, like, depending on who sees me in there, like if security spots someone like myself with my history, I've been attempted, like they've attempted to strip search me because the focus was more on the security. It's a bit like the gentleman talking before about protecting the community, like protecting the prison and their jobs rather than maybe finding out what I was doing in the rooms with the prisoners. They do want to change. They don't want to live like that. I mean, who would want to neglect their kids, like be locked up and, you know, like visit their kids through glass and wire and like they don't, you know. It's therapeutic community is the best thing I think that you could possibly even be considering, you know, like that's, the change happens in that sort of environment, you know, and it doesn't happen in jail. I'm not into longer sentences or shorter sentences. I just want to know what you're going to do with them while they're in there, really. If you're not going to do anything, I don't think it matters how long you put them in there for or how short it is. But if you're doing something with them, and then the sentencing is not really in question.
All right.
Thank you. Sam Biondo, I work at the Victorian Alcohol and Drug Association, and for my sins I used to work at Fitzroy Legal Service for quite a number of years, and the interesting thing about working about these places is that we deal with the same punters but in a different place. A very high correlation, obviously, people with alcohol and drug problems. And in prisons itself, some 70%, as I understand it, have used illicit drugs in the 12 months before. Thanks, Leonard, for pointing out alcohol and drug workers and mental health. I think many of us have moving into that direction for obvious reasons. There's a real association in what's going on with people and the damage that's being created. The question is to Rod. Rod, it's a difficult circumstance actually looking at prisoner health and knowing that you've got 40% of people in Victorian prisons that have got hepatitis C, but it must be extremely frustrating to know that you can't introduce the measures you need to stop it becoming an incubator for the rest of the community. I know there's been lots of community discussion in the ACT, for example, about some of the measures that they're looking at introducing, yet the frustrations that exist by many of us looking at the sentences people getting, potentially turning into death sentences, is extremely concerning. What can be done about that situation?
It's a good point, Sam. I think the reality is that needle exchange, and essentially that is what I think you're talking about, is unlikely to be introduced. And I think that even in the ACT, where there's been vigorous debate about it, I think they've decided not to proceed with it. And it all comes down to one incident in New South Wales where a staff member was stabbed with a blood-filled syringe and later died of AIDS. And the prison staff in every jurisdiction in Australia are so concerned about that that we will never, I think, certainly in the nearish future, get their support to introduce such a measure. Now, you might say that that's short-sighted, but the risk that they believe is inherent in an increase in the number of syringes, even if they're cleaner syringes, will make it just about impossible, I think, to introduce industrially. I'm not too disturbed at that, unfortunately.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to run over time, but we do have another session at the end this afternoon without panellists, so there'll be more time for reflecting on this session because we've had a very rich panel indeed. What we're going to do, just looking at the rest of the day, we're taking a full hour for lunch, and that's going to be served in the cafeteria in the main building. So as you go out the door from this centre here, just do a little dog leg to the left and then right into the building, and the cafeteria is at the front on Victoria Parade. So we've got the full hour for lunch. No such thing as a free lunch, so what we want you to do is just take a piece of paper with you, and you've seen the question, what does a humane and effective justice system look like? We'd like at least a sentence from each of you, perhaps a couple of dot points. We'll invite you to share some of those in the final session, and then to leave your pieces of paper with us at the end. And so that'll be part of our wrapping up of the proceedings. Then at the end of that final session, there's going to be another 3/4 of an hour for drinks and conversation for those of you able to stay until 5. So we've deliberately structured it with a lot of content this morning, but hopefully we can get some good conversation going over lunch. You can put something in writing over lunch, come back then for the session on transitional and post-release support, but then a final wrap-up session where we can all share together, and then time for conversation and drinks. So before we go to lunch, could I invite you to thank Rod and for all members of the panel. So please be back here punctually at 2:30.